welcome. More than a decade ago, lawmakers in Washington passed a prison reform law called the Prison Rape Elimination Act. Needless to say, sexual abuse in prisons has not been eliminated. Turns out this 2003 law has never been fully implemented. How come? States' rights and party politics, to name two reasons. We'll explain that and the scope of the problem in a moment. Also today, in our public intellectual segment, a scholar charts the route that women must take to get equal opportunity in the military. Then, Libraries Now, A Day in the Life. It's a new film that shows how an open door can change a life. All this, plus the Ellis Island that visitors don't see, abandoned halls that echo history. First, though, sexual abuse in prison. The most recent data suggests it's epidemic and increasing. Then why, even with federal funds at stake, are 7 Republican governors defying a law designed to lessen sexual assaults behind bars? How is sex abuse currently being addressed in prisons? Joining us, Cynthia Soohoo, director of the International Women's Human Rights Clinic at CUNY's Law School, and via Skype from Washington, D.C., Chris Daley with the human rights organization Just Detention International. Also via Skype from Tennessee, Alex Friedman of Prison Legal News magazine. Welcome to all of you.
Thank you.
And Chris Daley, let me start with you. First of all, how does this ever happen? For our viewers who've never been in prison and don't have a clue, one would think that the basic structure of prison, where people are locked up and separated from each other and there are guards, would prevent something as, physically large an act as a rape or a sexual assault from ever happening. How does this happen in prison?
Well, first of all, it happens because too few of us pay attention to what happens in prison. But in terms of how it functions within a facility, while you're right, we should have complete control over what happens in these facilities. Unfortunately, in adult facilities, 50% of the people committing the abuse are the people that we pay to have control. Staff members are committing abuse in 50% of the report cases in adult facilities, and in around 80% of the cases in juvenile facilities. So we have, unfortunately, predators on our payroll in facilities across the country. And then otherwise, we have situations in which those staff are not paying attention, or the facility is not laid out in a way that they can pay attention, or they're understaffed and aren't able to oversee folks in an appropriate way. And therefore, inmates are getting access to one another and committing abuse. And then staff aren't stepping in and preventing it when that happens.
And Cynthia Soohoo, this is particularly a tragedy when it happens to children. Obviously, it's a tragedy and a horrible crime when it happens to anyone. Are there different standards for protecting children behind bars from sexual assault?
Yes, one important thing that PREA does is the PREA Rape Elimination, the committee that developed the standards recognize that youth are particularly vulnerable
and
to
just
sexual
to get
violence.
the acronym straight for people, PREA is the Prison Rape Elimination Act that I mentioned before. It's called PREA.
That's right, Brian. And so there was a commission that actually spent a lot of time to develop these standards, and one of the things that they found was that youth are incredibly vulnerable to sexual violence. And so what the PREA standards do is they create a standard called the Youthful Inmate Standard, and it requires that youth be separated from adults in housing units, and also that if they're going to be exposed to adults in other settings, that there be supervision.
And how good is it here in New York, for example, the implementation of that?
How good is it here in New York? Well, that's an interesting question, Brian, because we've actually been trying to get information from the Department of Corrections in New York to find out what they're doing in order to comply with PREA. It looks like, I think in February, the Department of Corrections actually asked for money in order to fund creating separate facilities for youth. So that's potentially a positive development. Here in New York, I don't think that the governor has actually certified that New York is actually presently in compliance, but I think it's submitted a letter saying that it's planning to get into compliance over time. But the key issue really is going to be for the states that have issued these assurance letters, because 41 states have issued assurance letters, and only 2 states have actually said that they've certified compliance, is really whether the states are really serious about doing something.
And Alex Friedman of Prison Legal News, you're up on the politics of this. We're talking about PREA like it's already a law, but I mentioned that 7 Republican governors are resisting the law. Where's the disconnect?
Well, it is a law. It was a law passed by Congress in 2003 after a lengthy period of discussion. But then you had a 10-year implementation period. where the PREA committee was established. The commissioners established draft standards. Those standards went to the Department of Justice. The Justice Department took a fair amount of time to promulgate the actual standards, including public comment periods and so on. And finally, you had the standards issued back in 2012 and 2013. Last year was the first year that they began to go into effect. So this is not something that has suddenly been sprung on the states where they can't, come to grips with the standards and the different things that they're going to have to do to be in compliance. This has been a very long, drawn-out process where the states have all had the opportunity to participate in the development of the standards. So now, at this late date, over a decade after the law was first passed, for the governors to come out and say, oh no, we're just not going to be in compliance, we're not going to even accept funds to help us become into compliance, is a pretty strong statement.
And they won't accept the funds to come into compliance because?
Well, that is a very good question. PREA provides a penalty for states that do not comply with law. And that penalty is the loss of 5% of their federal funding for prison-related expenditures. Now, they can still accept the 5% as long as they certify that those funds will go toward compliance with PREA. These 7 states are simply saying, no, we're not going to even accept the funds for that purpose. And part of the reason for that might strictly be an economic reason, which is that they have calculated, they've run the numbers, and found out that compliance with PREA will actually cost more than the loss of 5% of their funding. Or that compliance with PREA will cost more than the 5% that they would get to become into compliance. So strictly from a dollars and cents measure, which is a terrible measure for crimes like rape and sexual abuse, that could be the reason
Right.
why they simply aren't accepting funds.
They're rejecting an unfunded mandate from Washington, and I think some of those governors say they can do it better their own way out of their own state funds. But Chris Daley, tell us, what do we mean by coming into compliance? What are some of these new standards that the governors in these cases are resisting implementing and accepting the federal funds to implement? What new standards?
Sure. So let's just talk about adult prisons and jails. There's about 52 different regulations, all of which have subsections that a facility would need to implement to be fully implementing the regulations. And so that really affects when a inmate comes into the facility. From the minute they come in, they're supposed to get particular information. They're supposed to be assessed for whether they're particularly vulnerable to abuse or particularly likely to perpetrate abuse. And then their housing decisions are supposed to be based on that. They then need to make sure that they get a full education on their rights to be free of sexual abuse and the ways to report abuse if it does occur. And then there's a number of follow-up services. Very similarly, for folks who are employees, there's a number of steps that need to happen in terms of their background and the way that they're staffed, monitoring of the employees as they do their job throughout the day, and then monitoring at points of promotion to make sure that people are not committing sexual abuse and that people aren't kept in the system if they are committing. So it's a whole range of regulations that really tries to shift the culture of custody. And listen, it is a challenge. No one said this was going to be easy. You don't address a crisis with an easy solution. The reason that so many governors are providing assurances right now is that if PREA is fully implemented, we're talking about some fundamental changes to the way that we hold people in custody. And that is a big process. And it's going to take a while to get there. And frankly, if we want effective policies, if we want to see the culture change that PREA promises, it's going to take us a little bit of time to get there. And so anyone who's saying this is hard, they're right. It's supposed to be hard. We're facing a crisis and it's going to take work to end it.
And Cynthia, are the new practices that are supposed to be put into place even more strict when it comes to protecting children?
Well, I mean, the PREA standards have general standards in terms of supervision, in terms of education, in terms of punishments for staff who are guilty of sexual violence. But the main standard for youth is really the standard that requires that they be separated from adults. But I think the other thing that we should keep in mind, Brian, is that as we're talking about the problem of compliance and the fact that the only stick that the government has is this funding requirement, where states stand to lose 5% of their funding if they don't comply with the PREA standards, is that many of the jails are actually run by counties. and the counties actually don't have the same funding, even that funding incentive to comply. And this is particularly important for youth because youth actually, the federal government has made the decision that youth don't belong in adult facilities, and so they aren't actually in federal facilities. And so when we're trying to protect youth, we really need to think about what's happening in the the state jails and prisons.
And how varied are the qualities of the states? In other words, how good are different states, New York and others,
Yeah.
at protecting children in these ways?
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing that's really exciting about PREA and also what the states are doing is that there is variation. And I think one great thing about PREA is that it actually, you know, the PREA Commission and the DOJ brought together these experts to think about what are the best practices, what should we be doing if we were really serious about ending sexual violence. And there are some states that are better, and there are some states, I think, and even counties that are leaders in implementing PREA. And so there's some, while we're actually opposed to youth ever being part in the adult criminal justice system, period, there's some.
And by youth, you mean what? People
under 18, I mean teenagers, I mean kids. There are some states that have made the decision that they're going to continue to try youth as adults, but they've decided that when they're incarcerated and when they're in detention, they're going to be in different facilities. Either they're put back in juvenile detention facilities until they turn 18 or older, or the adult correctional system has actually created separate facilities.
Chris, I understand that New Jersey is one of 2 states considered fully in compliance with PREA. Do you know that to be true? And can you talk about New Jersey if you know?
Sure, we don't know it to be true. That's what Governor Christie has said at this point. And I think, you know, back to Alex's point earlier, the PREA was passed in a bipartisan way. It was a Republican-controlled Congress. It was signed by President Bush. This has not been a partisan issue over the last decade. So any sense right now that it's starting to shake out that way, I think it's probably premature. That yes, we've seen a number of Republican governors who are taking a pass on PREA. Honestly, I think they're just getting bad advice from folks working below them. If you look at their letters, they don't understand the law. They are misstating what the requirements were at this point in time. They weren't mentioning that they could have provided insurance instead of a certification. And I think that we're going to see that going forward, the country is largely united, that people who are going to prisons and jails and juvenile detention facilities should not face sexual abuse as part of their sentence. And I think we're going to get to a point where people get back on board. I don't think this is a mass exodus from PREA.
Alex, is that your sense? Do you think that the politics are overstated here and that the Republican governors, the 7 of them who are resisting funds and full PREA compliance, are going to get back on board when they realize that maybe they've been misled, that maybe, as Chris says, this was a bipartisan law passed by a Republican Congress and signed by a Republican president?
I think it's less important that these particular governors happen to be Republican than it is that you have some of the largest states with the largest prison populations, such as Texas and Florida, that are not coming into compliance with PREA or stating that they're rejecting PREA. And so, yeah, I think the politics are less important than how it is eventually going to play out. I think eventually most governors are going to realize that, hey, rape is rape and sexual abuse is sexual abuse. Doesn't matter if it happens behind prison walls or out in the community. If they took the same position that, hey, it'd be too expensive to try to reduce rape of women in our community, they'd be pilloried. And I think the public opinion is coming around to understand, like Chris says, that rape is bad, rape is wrong, rape is illegal, and it doesn't matter who the victims are. This is a crime, and most governors who generally are tough on crime and want to hold people accountable when they commit crimes will eventually realize that, hey, rape in prison is a crime, and we need to take steps to reduce that, just like we would take steps to reduce rape and sexual abuse outside the prison context.
Alex, you're open about the fact that you have been incarcerated in your life. Mm-hmm. From your experience, how would you say the culture can be changed? Or is it not about the culture, it's just about the law and enforcement and zero tolerance?
It's a bit of both. I mean, obviously there is a prison culture, and a lot of the culture is basically the don't ask, don't tell type of culture where rape and sexual abuse is not discussed openly, where staff have this code of silence, where if they know that one of their fellow staff members is sexually abusing inmates, they simply don't say anything about it. So that's part of the culture that needs to change, particularly since Chris noted a large percentage, 50% of sexual assaults and rapes in prisons are committed by staff members, and that's even higher in juvenile facilities. So the culture doesn't just need to change among prisoners, but also among prison staff. The law certainly helps. Things like rape and sexual abuse reporting hotlines or intake education of inmates on PREA and sexual abuse related issues when they come into the system is very important. And having a classification system where prison officials can identify prisoners who are more likely to be victims of sexual assault, such as the mentally ill or prisoners who are small of stature, who are effeminate or gay. These are well known. These aren't something new that have suddenly been developed or understood. This is well known. It's just a matter of having corrections professionals get behind the standards and having lawmakers get behind the standards and implement them and actually do their jobs.
Well, we will see what happens in New York, in New Jersey, in places like Florida and Texas, which are among those resisting, but where there are gubernatorial elections this year. And thank you all very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Up next, women's equality in the military. Easier said than done. Time for Public Intellectual, where we look at new research with the power to change our minds and public policy. Early last year, the Pentagon announced it would lift the ban that limits women to combat support roles, such as flying helicopters, and allow them to fight alongside men. It hasn't happened yet. Mandating equality is never a simple matter. For example, the Marine Corps had to go back to the drawing board after trying to hold women to a standard required for male recruits, 3 pull-ups. The Marines found that 55% of women in boot camp could not do 3, while only 1% of their male peers failed to. An article in the journal Armed Forces and Society argues that women sometimes must be held to a different set of standards, what the author calls equivalency. And it's not just about physical strength. Via Skype from San Marcos, Texas, Connie Brownson joins us. She is the author of the article and the study behind it, and an ex-Marine. Her research, funded by the Marine Corps Heritage Foundation, is entitled The Battle for Equivalency: Female U.S. Marines Discuss Sexuality, Physical Fitness, and Military Leadership. Thank you for joining us. Welcome to our program, and hello from New York.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm happy to be here.
What were you trying to study with this research? What research question were you trying to answer?
Well, it's really interesting because it started out as an oral history project. You know, having been a Marine of the generation of, the mid-1990s, I wanted to see what had really changed because it looked like women were doing amazing things now with the lionesses and all these different roles that they were playing. So I wanted to go back and see what their experience was like now, assuming that there had been all of these really amazing gains that had been made. And what my research found was that they're almost exactly in the same place where we were back in the day, in the mid-'80s, where they still had to fight the stereotypes. They still had to fight the disparity in the standards. They still had to figure out how they could make it in a man's world in the gun club. And so this is really what emerged from what I went back to see, and I was completely amazed that it hadn't become something very different than what I had experienced back then.
Were you looking for changes specifically since that change in policy that's really fairly recent, less than 2 years, I think, that would allow women to perform every combat role?
Well, what's really interesting is there's been incremental changes over time. For example, when I was in boot camp, we didn't even qualify with the rifle. We didn't drill with the rifle. We didn't run 3 miles. So there's been all these incremental changes over time. But then recently, I'd say within the past 15 years, all of a sudden there has been this push for equality. Women their standards have to be equal to men. And that's really where I found there's a disparity now, that they're starting to fall when we come to this level of, quote, equality.
So you're drawing a distinction between equality and equivalency. Talk about that.
Exactly. Equivalency means I'm coming into the game with a completely different tool set than you. I am not physically your equal. Intellectually, yes. And I can do a lot of other tasks maybe that you can't. So it's really a matter of negotiating what we bring to the table as Marines, as warfighters, as people, and how then we figure out how to make this warfighting force completely successful instead of having it dysfunctional where we have this disparity in, equality in terms of standards.
But then let's talk about the example that I gave before, which is going to press a lot of people's buttons.
Yes.
3 pull-ups. If most men, 99% of men, can do 3 pull-ups, and only, 45% of women can do 3 pull-ups, does that not matter for what kind of tasks women can be assigned in combat?
Well, what I've had to say throughout is the fact that the Marine Corps is kind of a hard-headed organization. Love them lots, but there's a long history in terms of being the superior physical force. Maybe that's not the best measure of upper body strength. Other services, for example, the Army, they do push-ups instead of pull-ups. If you look at women's bodies physiologically, our weight is way down in our bodies, whereas men's, it's up very high. And there's actually been some controversy over men kipping, which is where they actually use their body motion to pull themselves up. Now they have to be specifically dead hang pull-ups.
But if you're, let's say, dragging an injured colleague across a battlefield towards safety, that individual doesn't care if you're a man or a woman. That injured body only knows that it needs to be dragged by a certain amount of strength. So is the pull-up test not an indicator of that, or whatever else the life and death task might actually be for a man or a woman Marine in combat, and perhaps should be changed?
And again, that's not my call. I don't make policy, but from my perspective, I think maybe things to be, the whole testing system needs to be reevaluated to make sure that we're actually having people perform physical fitness tests that correspond to real life situations to make everything successful for everybody involved.
Perhaps there are things that women do better than men. I think there's been some research that indicates they may be better combat pilots than men. Correct me if I'm wrong, or maybe you're familiar with that. Maybe they shoot better. I have no idea. But are you familiar with any of those differences that might actually advantage women in equality tests with men?
I can't actually speak to the studies. That's not something I went into this entire project looking at. Again, it was an oral history project, more about experiential situations rather than let's juxtapose policy versus what the reality is. What happened was I came up with data that just flew in the face of everything that I'm seeing in the media. So that it's very much apples and oranges in that sense. But what I'm hearing from these female Marines is that they can go out there, they can do the job. It's just not necessarily in the way that the political and the social expectations are for them, if that makes sense.
What kind of job can they do they're not being allowed to do, for example?
A lot of them are opposed to combat. As a matter of fact, there's only one woman in all of the ones that I interviewed for this survey, for this entire research project, that said that women should not be in combat, particularly in the infantry. But again, you have so many levels.
Sorry, let me get that straight. Almost all the women did think that women should be in the infantry, or did not think they should?
Okay, infantry is different from combat.
Okay.
Combat is where they are right now.
Okay.
Infantry is in the 0100 MOS, which means you've got all of these layers of expectation, of process that you have to go through. For example, what's going on right now with the combat infantry officer training at Quantico. Similarly, what's going on with the infantry training at Camp Geiger in North Carolina. The ones in North Carolina are doing very well comparatively. The ones at Quantico are failing miserably. But it's a completely different level of expectation. I think if we rethink what the expectations are for these women, I think things could be a lot different in terms of their success rates.
The other two issues in your study I see were sexuality and leadership. Is it that leadership is an end goal, but sexuality and physical distractions get in the way?
Yes, sexuality, it's in the workplace. Don't bring sex into the workplace. It's that simple. And what happens is the men feel like they're either being favored or they're using their sexuality to secure some kind of benefit. And the women say the same thing. For example, if you go to Parris Island, South Carolina, to recruit training, it used to be that the men and the women would all go and bivouac in tents. I'm not sure when it changed, but when I did my study, the women were now bivouacked in wooden, I guess not tents, but something similar. They wooden houses, because someone on the political side said that these women shouldn't be out there without some kind of protection. But what the women are coming to me and saying is, we don't want the special accommodations. We want exactly what the men are experiencing, because that's the only way that we will win this equivalency, this sense of respect for doing the same thing that they're doing.
How about the issue that's been in the news so much recently, sexual assault in the military, which shocks so many people? They would have thought in a disciplined military environment like that, a command and control environment, there more than in society at large, this would have been eradicated or close to it. How much did this come up in your study if you were looking for it?
No, it came up very much. And what I found and what the women were telling me is that, again, sexuality should not be in the workplace. However, in the Marine Corps environment, you can't necessarily separate the workplace from the home place. If you're living in the barracks, that's your home place. But it's also your workplace, because everybody is still there. You come from the same place, you go to the same place. And for example, if you talk about first responders, they get to go home at night. They get to leave their workplace to go to a home place. But in the military environment, it's always the same. So if you have such a small minority of women, this small percentage living in this space, competing for male attention, the males are definitely competing for their attention, it's going to become a problem. And it's not that these men are misogynist, not at all. These men love women. But what we have, and I hate to use it, but it's blurred lines. When they're sending out these mixed signals of wanting to be with the men want to be with them, but how do you really negotiate all of these relationships in a very small, literally, geographic space?
It
It's
isn't
really
just zero tolerance for assault. It sounds like you're describing the complexity of relationship. That's different than attacking somebody.
No. It's zero tolerance for assault. However, the complexity comes in when the women are sending the mixed signals to the men. And in the article in particular, at the very end, it talks about an EEO officer who says, where the young men are coming to her and saying, you know, Gunny, I don't know what to do when these girls are coming on to me. You know, she laughs at the dirty joke. She thinks everything's cool and fun, and she's running around in like almost no clothes doing PT. You know, what do I really do with that? And she's struggling with trying to manage that, and then telling these young ladies, don't be running around like that. Don't be sending them mixed signals.
Well, thanks for sharing your research with us. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me.
For our next guests, going to the library is about a lot more than taking out books. It's about relationships and community. That's the message very eloquently making the rounds online thanks to filmmaker Julie Dressner. The film is called Libraries Now, A Day in the Life. We'll show some clips. And also in our studio, librarian and activist Christian Zabriskie. He's the founder of Urban Librarians Unite. Welcome.
Thank you.
And let's just start by showing people some of the video that brought you here. Libraries Now, A Day in the Life. Check out this excerpt.
Sometimes I go before the doors even open because there'll already be people waiting there. I'm at the library this morning because the afternoon is extremely crowded. There's usually no computers available. I am 27 now. I was 17 when I had my son. I'm applying for financial aid so I can finish my nursing degree. When you apply for TAP, that's like a different website from the FAFSA one. The librarian was very helpful. She just knew what to do.
Have you picked up books for Bonnie?
These are for Bonnie. This is for a book discussion which she's going to be taking part of.
They know me so well. I used to send emails. Such and such a book came out. Could you send it to me? I'd get a response. It was sent to you yesterday.
You got to go out to Bonnie, okay?
I'm homebound, and I can't go to the library. I will read anything, practically, except romance stories. I do draw the line at that.
I've been looking for a job for a couple months.
How you doing, Jerome? Come on in, have a seat.
I didn't have everything growing up. I've been in foster care. For kids in foster care, like, this is like a safe haven. I'm looking to become a counselor. I've worked at after-school programs. I've also worked for summer programs, and I've worked for the library, helping kids. The library has really been a key part of my life growing up, whether I'm going through something or just needing help in school.
There's nothing on here that says that you want to work with young adults. And I will work with you to get some entry-level work. Are you with me on it?
Yes, all the way.
Wait a minute, are you excited?
Yes, extremely.
I'm excited.
Couple of minutes of libraries now, a day in the life. We'll see some more in a minute. Julie, what'd you make this film? You and your co-producer.
Well, I think I first began to think seriously about making a film about the role that libraries play in people's lives, specifically people in New York City, when I was at Grand Army Plaza on a Sunday, and I saw the huge crowds of people waiting for the library to open on Sunday at 1 p.m. And I thought, why isn't the library opening up earlier, given this great demand? And then I was surprised to learn that there are only 8 of the city's 211 neighborhood branches that are open on Sundays at all.
So you wanted to make a political case that people are out there using the libraries on Sundays, and so the funding should be directed to doing that or increased so they can do that?
I mean, I was interested in looking at what was happening inside of the libraries. I mean, some people, might assume that libraries would become obsolete in the internet era. But in fact, I read a report by the Center for an Urban Future where I learned that, in fact, the opposite is true, and that in the last 10 years, the attendance in the library's free programs actually jumped 88%. So that interested me as a filmmaker and finding out. So, it went up to 2.5 million people participating in programs. So I thought, let's take a look at what these folks are doing in there.
Christian, we'll get you in here in a minute. I want to just go right on to another excerpt from the film. This one focuses on how immigrants in New York use the libraries.
Can someone tell us about a problem they had in their apartment?
We offer free education for the children and free learning for the parents.
What was the first solution? You should call the landlord.
I'm from Bangladesh. When I came to New York, I dropped my son in school. Every parent, they speak their children teacher. I can speak. I don't understand even language. And then one day, one lady, she's sending flyer in front of the school, and I take the flyer. Program give me the knowledge. Now I help other immigrant family.
嗰段時間咧，我喺屋企好悶，個人好似戇戇地，所以要飲藥。所以我每一日咧，我就要飲安眠藥啊、定身藥啊。
I wake up at 7 a.m.
但係而家自從我翻圖書館之後咧，所以我覺得好開心，所以我而家其他咩藥我都唔需要飲。Can you help me check it out?
Oh, sure. I will help you.
Okay, thank you. I talk English for people. I really happy.
More from Libraries Now, a day in the life. Christian Zabriskie, I have you as founder of Urban Librarians Unite and the Volunteer Library Brigade.
Oh, yeah.
So you like the Che Guevara of libraries?
I wish. I mean, I'd love to be on everybody's T-shirt. That would be nice. You know, librarians are actually a lot more radical than people give us credit for. I think I'm just louder about it than most people, but we're out there in the community all the time. I mean, you mentioned the Volunteer Library Brigade. This is something where my group goes out and we take volunteers. Some of them are librarians, some of them are civilians, people who are not library trained, who are interested in the work that we do, and we go out into the community and we answer reference questions and we do guerrilla story times and give people the opportunity to see the work that's happening in the library. For people who may not use the library, they may not come in the door, and also take some of the mystery around off of it as well. That, you know, when you enter a search in Google, it just kind of magically happens. But here you get to see me do the work.
So you think people don't get this?
Oh, I think people are surprised by it. They're astonished by it. I mean, this is what I love about Julie's movie, is that it's the actual, real, tangible work that we do. I mean, the profession is its own, in some ways is its own worst enemy. People have us an expectation of what we are, and that has changed so much.
So let's watch another excerpt from the movie, Emphasis, Community Support.
I had a knot in my cheek, and they found out that I had cancer, and I had to go for radiation 5 days a week. And I was very depressed. When I came here, I just joined with all the laughter and the fun times and the chit-chat. I joined in with it. It's like a new life for me.
Every day after school, I'll shake my teacher's hand, tell her where I'm going.
My son, Isaiah, he's 9. I usually can't pick him up after school.
I go to the library and do my homework. It doesn't only have librarians, it also has a security guard to watch over us and keep us quiet and let us stay focused. Where can you find science books?
Science books? What type of science books? Science experiments?
Like mummies. It's like when your parent is not around, it's like they're your parent.
I always just thought you guys were playing dominoes.
Oh, no, no.
Teach your mahjong, you teach us dominoes.
Sounds like a fair deal.
How often are you here?
Almost every day.
After school?
If I don't have work, yes.
Oh, what do you work?
I work at McDonald's.
Oh, good.
I want to work in the food industry,
feel
eventually move
I
up.
was a cook for Staten Island Hospital for 22 years.
Anthony, that was my father's name. If you want, I could put you in touch with
yeah.
the person in the volunteer office.
From Libraries Now, a day in life. Why are all these things the functions of libraries? For people who still think libraries are about the books or about the reference librarians and, you know, looking stuff up and being helped to look stuff up, or more recently about internet access, why all this other stuff? Playing that game, kids after school, all of these things.
I mean, what I realized from making the film is that these are really, it's like the new public town square. It's a place that's open to everyone, and that the institution seems to be incredibly flexible, adapting to what people's needs are. And they are doing so many different kinds of things.
Well, and why?
I mean, because we can. That's why. Because our citizens need it. Because they need someone to be an intellectual first responder. This is how I refer to us now. I mean, that young man who needed help getting a job, he needed someone to step in and help him with his resume and guide him through his process to find work or to find fellowship. Or for these older folks who are making these connections, they need a space that is provided for them. And we create that space for them and ask nothing of them. I mean, there is no other place in our community and society where you can go and receive these things for free, where you can go and receive dignity for free, for that matter. So we do these things because we can, and because it is our obligation to our public for us to do that.
Talk a little more about your work. You work with teens in Queens, for
I work
example.
with, actually, I work with folks of every age in Queens. I work with, I've done a lot of work with teens in Queens. I've done a lot of work with at-risk teens and these kinds of stuff. I work with young people. I work with old people. My library, Queens Library, is very flexible. It's very forward-facing. We have a program now where you can check out a tie from the library. I realized that guys were coming in, they needed a job interview coming up, they didn't have the uniform. So a colleague of mine, Lauren, who you've spoken with in the past, set up this whole thing at a number of our libraries where we had donated ties, and you check them out just like a book. So you can go and prep for that interview, go get that job.
And libraries around the country are checking out all kinds of things. I read about a library checking out plots of land that people can grow vegetables on, and then they return them. So the library today is not what the library was 50 years ago.
We've always been a creation space. The Fahrenheit 451, part of that was written in a library on a typewriter, which Ray Bradbury rented by the hour. I mean, libraries have always been this function. We're just more visible now.
Julie, did you often find that the libraries were performing services for the mentally ill? I think you documented some of that.
Well, I mean, what we found was that the libraries are a place where many different kinds of governmental, nonprofit organizations were going to conduct outreach. So, for example, when organizations want to find people who need subsidized nutrition or heat, they're conducting outreach in the libraries. And the same is happening with healthcare. So the libraries, for example, Queens Public Library will invite a healthcare provider to come in and do a seminar, a workshop on anxiety or stress. And then they're able to make referrals to library users to low-cost or free mental health services.
Let's see the end of the film.
Oh, how wonderful!
Every black bag is a surprise for me. I open it up and I go, it's Christmas!
Oh!
They know the kids, their routines, who usually picks them up. She'll say, Isaiah, start packing up, your mom is here. It's great that his homework gets done. It gives us a little bit more time. At the end of the day, that's what you want to do with your children, is spend time with them.
At the time, we just wanted a place to go and just hang out.
A couple patrol officers came by and they issued a lot of summonses to all of us for standing outside doing nothing.
I know some of us don't really want to go home for different reasons.
We want them to be here where it's safe.
My first instance was, oh God, these people, I'm never gonna make friends with them. And then after like
2 years later,
2 years later, they are like my second family.
I mean, I love all of you.
The library is sort of like an alternative place, and the librarians, we're authority figures, but we're not grading them, we're not there to judge them. I think that's an important thing.
The library is closing in 10 minutes.
People ask, why are you closed in the mornings? Why aren't you open Sundays? Why do you have to close at 6?
The library is now closing in 5 minutes.
The library doors close and their parents aren't home. I don't really know where else they're gonna go, and that scares me a little.
So you conclude, as people could read, with a plea for funding.
We need funding because we need hours. I mean, this is what it really breaks down to. It's not, we're not looking for funding so that we can have magic or some, extra stuff. We need staff to open more hours to serve our public. That's what we do. That's what we're trying to do. And it's really hard because, as it is, my library, Queens Library, where I work as my day job, is open 11 to 7 most days, which is a pretty good accommodation, or at least an attempt to try and make that happen. It's still very hard for working families.
So you as a librarian and a librarian activist are hoping this film, and you must as a filmmaker who decided to make this film, gets seen and heard at City Hall. And this is budget season right now.
Right now.
They come to a budget by the end of this month for the next year. Do they see it? Do they hear it?
I hope so. I hope they're watching it right now.
There's a possibility that they'll show the video at the budget hearing in the City Council this week. So hopefully it will be seen and the message will be received.
It's hard, right? There are so many good causes. There are so many. You could go through, 15 other, probably 1,500 other city services that feel that they're underfunded, that provide vital tools for people of New York City to survive and try to get ahead.
Absolutely. And they are underfunded, and they need the funding as well. I'm here for my parcel, which is that the libraries need an additional $65 million this year in the budget in order to be open 6 days a week. And yes, these are wonderful. There's wonderful programs out there. The one thing that makes libraries a little bit different is that we are already in situ everywhere across the city. There's really never a point where you're more than a half an hour's walk away from a library in the city. And we're already in place. And so that's something where we need to leverage that out more, and we need to do more.
Christian Zabriskie, Julie Dressner, who made this film with Jesse Hicks, thank you very much. Ellis Island, the port for immigrants entering America until 1954, is now a museum. Well, actually, only part of it is. Another part is a ruin, a whole set of abandoned buildings on the south side of the island. What's that look like? Is it worth restoring? Something people have been trying to do for 15 years. Fortunately, in 2002, photographer Paul Margolis managed to capture the Ellis Island we visitors don't get to see. His work, Hidden Ellis Island, is now on display at St. Peter's Church in Manhattan. Joining us, photographer Paul Margolis. Welcome.
Thank you.
And we're going to see a number of your photographs. Set this up for us. What were you doing there in 2002? What were you shooting with? Why?
Well, at the time, I was using a film camera. And that particular day, I was there with people from an organization that was trying to raise funds to restore the south part of the island, the unrestored part of the island. And my original intention was to do 35 millimeter quick, rapid photography and come back with a larger format of camera that would give greater sharpness, more detail. And for a number of reasons, it never really worked out. So the images that I intended to use as notes ended up as the project.
So let's look at image number one. What do we have here?
These are doors to a hospital, quarantine, mortuary wing, and they were just open.
They had a mortuary wing and a hospital?
They did, yes.
On Ellis Island?
They had a maternity wing as well, I understand. And over the years, I don't know the exact figure, but a number of people died there. They would come sick with diseases that in today's world probably were curable, and they would die.
Why there? If people think of Ellis Island as a big, say, customs station, it was more than that? You didn't just arrive and move through into the city?
The vast majority of people did, but there were inspectors and doctors throughout the whole process, so that if somebody looked ill or was coughing or had a strange-looking growth or inflamed eye.
Because you weren't allowed in with certain kinds of conditions.
Right. So people would be quarantined. There was a quarantine wing there. And some people were so sick that they actually died. Others actually were sent back to wherever they came from.
Slide number two. What are we looking at here?
Again, this is an expanse of windows in that same wing.
So let's go right on to image number three.
This is a corridor. This actually is an interesting image because people have said that this is the maternity wing, by the way, and this faces out into the harbor on the side where the Statue of Liberty is. And people have told me in two separate exhibitions that they can see a nurse holding a baby, like a ghostly creature at the far end. Now, I know that it happens to be an open door at the end there, and that's literally the light at the end of a corridor.
I
But
see
people have
exactly
said-
what you're referring to.
But people have said, if one person had said it, I would have dismissed it. But 3 people in 3 different exhibitions said exactly the same thing.
And for anybody who thinks there's no depth on your television screen, look how far down that hallway you can see. And all the way at the end, that figure that is an open door and some light coming through, I guess, looking like a woman holding a baby.
That's what people have said.
So what's the goal here? Well, here's the next image. All right, let's take a look at this, and then we'll take a minute before we go on to more images and talk about what the goal here is of the people who want to restore some of this. How about this one?
This was an entryway into that whole hospital wing. They're really, the island is sort of like a horseshoe. So the north side of the island has the large, has the Great Hall, has where immigrants came, and nearly all of them were processed through and went on to new lives in America. This was the entrance to the hospital, maternity, mortuary wing, where this part has since been restored. This picture's from 2002. I understand that a few years later there actually was a restoration of this much, of what you can see sort of to the end through the doors there.
But nobody can go there.
I don't believe people can. I think that possibly several times a year that part of the island is open up for special tours, but in general, no.
So who wants to do what and why?
That, well, I'm out of the loop for the Ellis Island restoration because, as I said, I did this 12 years ago. But there is an interest in restoring these areas because they are as historically valid as the area where people pass through.
And so then the tourists, the visitors would also come through there, just like we're coming through as tourists right now through these images. This one?
That's a stairway between several of the floors, also on the same wing. All of these photographs were done in the same complex of buildings, this long series of corridors and stairways.
And another?
And that image is from a secure detention area. If you notice the window, you can't really break that and escape. And something or someone broke a hole in that, and the Statue of Liberty is visible through it.
Wow, it is the Statue of Liberty, isn't it?
Oh yeah, and in the middle set of panes on the right, there's also a tiny American flag on Liberty Island.
We're going to show you a video now. Paul evolved as a photographer, technologically and journalistically, and here's a brief video. Let's watch it, and then we'll talk some more.
I understand in the abstract that zeros and ones can make images, but the idea of bits of silver being sensitized to light and then being taken through the rest of these processes is much more understandable to me. But I was a much more serious documentary photographer when I was in my 20s and 30s. And I think now a lot of it is just finding what's amusing in life, just stopping instants of things that are entertaining to me. That I don't know that I look for deep meaning or to change the world, but I like things that make me happy and entertain me. So I think that's probably part of the process of getting older. I have a gift for spotting the bizarre. I always have, even as a little kid, that I can always see the bizarreness. And it was just when I picked up the camera that allowed me to capture it. Like the bizarre and the absurd in everyday life. The things that people either don't see or would rather look away from or don't stare at. So, but I have to say that the camera has certainly given me license to intrude into all sorts of situations where otherwise I might not be welcome. So it's like a magic carpet. takes you into areas you never would have gone.
That portrait created by BrianLehrer.tv producer Shannon Ayala. Like that?
That's very good.
Do you feel that technology has changed the nature of your work? You started by saying you used film in a camera in 2002. Oh, I remember film. Now it's all digital, just about. Does it matter to what you shoot or the cultural meaning of it?
Let me see if I can answer. Well, I still shoot film. A great deal of my personal work is done, even today, as in that film, with a film camera and black and white film that I process and print myself. The other side of that is work that I do during the day, which is digital, because it's the modern world and what people use. I like film. I like being part of a continuum that goes back 160 years and encompasses the great picture magazines, the photography of the Great Depression. And I like the tactile nature of film, of being able to control an entire process.
Where can people see the exhibit? Until when?
It is at called the Living Room Gallery at St. Peter's Church, Lexington Avenue and 54th Street until June 29th.
They still have jazz vespers at that church?
I think they do, yes. I've seen ads for that.
Jazz and photography at St. Peter's. Thank you for sharing it with us.
Thank you.
And that's our program for this week. You'll find a new show here each week at this hour. Next time, what Europeans expect from the internet that Americans don't, the right to be forgotten. And tune into my radio program weekdays from 10 a.m. until noon on WNYC 93.9 FM and AM 820. I'm Brian Lehrer. Thanks for watching.